Chapter 18, Tayul. Sunny meets me at the gate when I come home. She tells me what happened in the schoolyard. As usual, I'm tired from work in the airstrip. I only half listen till she mentions Hewan's name. Hewan. Sometimes she comes to fetch Junction at our house. She's my age and really pretty. I feel my face growing a little warm. Sunny doesn't seem to notice. Good, she whispers. The principal took one look at her and sent her back to her place in line. No one's around to hear us, but I can tell she's afraid even so. He told her, Buntaro-san, to pick someone else. I think for a moment, then I say, they have no brother. No brother, she stops, thinking instead of asking. I choose my next words carefully. Their father must feel that there's no one but himself to watch out for his family. But does that mean, do you think that he could be... She swallows. Like me, she can't say it. Can't say the words, Chimopa. Suddenly, I pound the gate, cursing under my breath. Damn the Japanese in this stinking war. Her mouth opens, then closes again, but there's still shock in her eyes. Oops. It's wrong to scare her even more. I try to speak calmly. It won't be enough for Junjin. Wondering if people might guess the truth, I say. You should just be kind to her. Just be careful of what you say when you're with her. She nods, but she still looks scared. I don't know what else to say. Later, I hear that those girls weren't even allowed to go home and say goodbye to their families. They were taken by truck straight to the train station. After that, probably a train to the coast and a boat to Japan. And then what? A factory somewhere sewing uniforms? Maybe. It was a spring night, the house dark and quiet. Everyone's in bed. Suddenly, there are loud voices at the gate. Before we can even get up off our mats, half a dozen soldiers burst into the courtyard. They turn on the electric light and shove open all the doors. I blink and squint and can hardly see. Up, all of you, their leader orders. Stand there together, against the wall. Shivering in our nightclothes, even though it's not cold. We gather around Abjui. Amoni's arm it crosses in front of our body. She's in her nightgown. Why won't they at least let her cover herself? The leader stays with us while his men search every room in the house. They open cupboards, throw things around, overturn furniture, lift straw floor mats. After a few minutes, Abjui clears his throat. If the honorable officer would be so good as to tell me what he's seeking, perhaps I could be of assistance in locating it. Treasonous writings, the officer answers curtly, writings that express lies and slander against His Divine Majesty's benevolent presence in this country. And we need no assistance. If such writings are here, we will find them. You can be sure of that. Besides me, he stiffens suddenly. I move my hand to take hold of her arm. She's trembling. I squeeze her arm a little, trying to calm her. Treasonous writings. Are they looking for a copy of Uncle's newspapers? There aren't any here, I know that for sure. Right after he left, I looked all over the house, dozens of times. I never even found a scrap of one. Besides, they'd searched the house themselves back then. Do they think he'd still contact us? For the first time, I'm glad he hasn't kept in touch with us. If he had, they might find him somehow. One by one, the soldiers came back into the courtyard. They're all holding papers. They put them down on the table before the leader. I glanced down quickly, mostly Abjui's work, but also Sunhee's diary. Is that what she's worried? Surely she's written nothing that can get us in trouble. She's only a girl. The officer picks up the papers and looks over them quickly. Documents and lessons planned for Abjui's school, but the officer doesn't care about these. He looks at them, then crumples them and tosses them on the floor. Finally, he reaches for Sunhee's diary. He flicks through the pages. Sunhee clutches at her nightshirt, just like Amoni. The officer looks up. Whose stupid scribblings are these? He asks abruptly. Sunhee answers at once. Mine, she says. I'm surprised by her voice. It's strong, not shaky. And she stopped trembling. He sneers. Idiotic thoughts, written in a beautiful hand, he says. Do not waste the glory of fine kanji on such nonsense. Is it a crime against our divine emperor? You are fortunate that I will grant leniency this one time. Any more of this and I will not be so merciful. He hands the diary to another soldier and makes a brusque gesture. The soldier takes the diary to the kitchen and throws it into the stove. Sunhee takes one step forward, and I pull her back. The officer finishes his inspection of the papers. He tears the last few into shreds. We know that this town breeds a worm of treason, he shouts. We will hunt it down and grind it under our heel. All of you have been warned. If we find out later that you knew anything of this treason, you will suffer the same fate as the traitor himself. Then he stomps out in fury, his men behind him. The gate clangs shut. Sunhee breaks free of my grasp and runs to the stove to try and save her diary. She reaches right into the fire. Too late. There's only a few burnt scraps of paper left. She kneels on the floor holding them, moaning next to her with a wet rag, wiping away the soot and ashes. Sunhee's fingertips are turning red, starting to swell. It must hurt, but she doesn't cry. I pace and clench my fists, wishing there was something I could do. Abjui comes over, his face worried. He watches Amoni tend to Sunhee, but doesn't say anything. He just stands there. Seeing him like that makes me remember of Uncle's stories from years ago, when he'd been hurt after the Olympics. He couldn't work for a few weeks, so he stayed home. Sunhee and I loved that. He was always around to tell us stories. My father, your grandfather, was a great scholar, Uncle said. He was resting on his mat. Sunhee and I were sitting on the floor to one side. He devoted his entire life to studying. It took him many years and many attempts, but late in life he finally passed the difficult examinations and was appointed a scholar by the royal court. I was only a small boy, but I remember how proud he was of the day that he put the jade button on his top knot. The button meant that he had passed the examinations. He let me touch it just once, to feel how smooth and round it was. Uncle smiled, a sad smile, then shook his head. Only a few weeks later, the Japanese ordered all men to cut off their top knots, to wear their hair short in the Japanese style. They said top knots were too Korean. Your grandfather would not do it. He'd worked too hard for the jade button. He looked away from us, at nothing, like he was seeing something inside his head. A place or a time far away. His voice seemed to come from far away, too. One day, 3 soldiers came to the house. They burst in without being invited and found my father in his room. 2 of them held him down, while the third one cut off his top knot. And then one of them stole the J button. I was young, only 4 or 5 years old. I hid behind my mother's skirt, so frightened. I wanted to help somehow, but what could I do? He shook his head again. But it wasn't enough, just to cut off his beautiful top knot. One of them took a big handful of hair and threw it into the kimchi pot. He stared at it for a while, and all the time he and his friends were laughing. Uncle's voice was so angry that he had to stop speaking for a few moments. The kimchi pot. Every Korean home had one. A big ceramic pot sunk into the floor of the courtyard, so deep a man can almost stand inside. The pot keeps the spiced pickled cabbage from freezing during the winter. The kimchi is scooped out with a huge wooden ladle. The pot is always carefully covered because anything that falls in is hard to get out. Strands of hair. It would have been impossible to get them all out. But where was Abjui, I said. He was a lot older than you. Maybe he could have helped. Abjui's 10 years older than Uncle. Uncle frowned. I think he was there too, but maybe not. Maybe he was at school. I don't remember. For weeks afterward, my mother had to pick hair out of the kimchi. She tried to do it without my father seeing, but no matter how careful she was, there was sometimes still hair in the servings of kimchi. And every time this happened, my father could not eat. A few months later, he took ill and died. I do not remember what illness he had, but it does not matter. He died of a broken heart. I remember Uncle's eyes glittering with pain and anger. I remember something else, too. How I'd felt hearing about Abjui, the way he'd done nothing to help. Back then, I couldn't understand it. Why hadn't he done something? Those soldiers tonight tearing apart our house, and me, I just stood there frozen. I hadn't done anything. I hadn't even said anything. And I'm 3 years older than Abjui was then. I now know. What could he have done? What could any of us do? Chapter 19, Sunhee. When the officer asked whose scribblings are these, I'd answered at once. And right at that moment, I hadn't felt afraid. I felt proud. Proud that those were my words on the pages he was holding. Now, all the words I'd written for so many months were lost. My thoughts and feelings, they were part of me, and it was as if that part had burned up in that stove, too. There was an empty space inside me where those words had been. Besides, I'd been keeping the diary especially for Uncle. It was going to be a sort of a present for him, and now it was gone. I would fail at everything I tried to do for him. After the soldiers left, no one said anything about what had happened. Amoni wrapped my burned hand, and we all went back to bed. But a few minutes later, I heard Abjui's quiet voice. Sunny, I'm sorry about your writing. In the dark, I could feel my heartbreak speed up. My diary wasn't exactly a secret. I often wrote it in the evenings when we were all in the sitting room together. But I'd never shown it to anyone, and never realized that Abjui had noticed me working on it. I felt a pulse of pride in my throat. I swallowed hard and managed to reply, Thank you, Abjui, but it was nothing really. No, he answered, it was not nothing. He paused a moment, so his next words seemed to fill up the darkness. But do not forget, Sunhee, they burn the paper, not the words. I woke the next morning with Abjui's words in my head. I started a new diary that very day. Not even the pain of my blistered fingers could stop me. You burn the paper, but not the words. You silence the words, but not the thoughts. You kill the thoughts only if you kill the man. And you will find that his thoughts rise again in the minds of others, twice as strong as before. Abjui was right. While I couldn't remember all of the diary entries, I was able to recall many of them, especially the poems. The pages were filled even faster than before, old words and new ones mixed together. I had that Japanese officer to thank for making me more determined than ever to write things down. I realized something else, too. I thought about Abjui's promise to teach me Hangul one day, and now I knew exactly when that would be, when the Japanese no longer ruled Korea, when we were our own country again. For that to happen, the Japanese had to lose the war. If they won, they'd be here forever. I thought back to the airdrop of leaflets, how glad I'd been to find out that Americans knew that Koreans and Japanese weren't the same. I remembered hoping the Americans would come fight the Japanese and throw them out of our land, but I hadn't realized until now what it would mean to have them gone. If the Japanese lost the war, Uncle could come home. If they lost, Abjui could be principal of his own school. We could learn Korean history. We could use our real names again. And Abjui could teach me the Korean alphabet. How could an alphabet, letters that didn't even mean anything by themselves, be important? But it was important. Our stories, our names, our alphabet, even Uncle's newspaper. It was all about words. If words weren't important, they wouldn't try so hard to take them away.